Okay. Well, welcome to the first audio episode of The Wood Review with John Wood Jr. Although this category of episodes I think we will refer to as the Wood Review Philosophy. How about that? The Wood Review Philosophy episode, the Wood Review Philosophy category episode 1. That's not particularly catchy. But okay, well, I'll figure out something else to call these as we go forward here. There'll be a playlist name on the YouTube channel if you're listening to this on YouTube, which easily kind of identifies this apart from the video podcast episodes we'll be having that deal more with politics in an up-to-date kind of way. Well, in a more focused way. But clearly, I opened this up with a brief kind of reference to this issue of how do I identify this particular format of episodes, because there's a distinction that I'm making here between the purpose of these audio podcasts and the videos that you'll likely see promoted on social media, perhaps a little bit more potentially. We'll promote these too, but videos have a way of capturing people's attention in a more kind of immediate way. And with those video episodes, therefore, I think it's important to kind of tackle the news of the day in a little bit more of an up-to-date fashion. I mean, I've never wanted to be a person who chased headlines as a commentator, exactly, or as a thinker, because I don't think that's necessarily conducive to deep thought. But in any event, but it's important for me to, on the one hand, be out there and be involved in the more kind of day-to-day political dialogue. But it's also important for me to have a format to be able to sort of step back with you and to take a broader view of the sort of overarching philosophical issues confronting society. And I think that this audio format is a little bit better for that. For one, there's a certain pressure taken off of me, I think, not being on the camera. I'm a person who's been on camera a fair amount in my life, and at least more so than the average person. I shouldn't overstate it. But, I enjoy receiving questions from other people, and I'm perfectly comfortable on camera receiving questions from other people or speaking to an audience, to a live audience, I should say, a live audience of people in my physical presence. But when it's just me talking to a camera straight away, with nobody else in the room aside from maybe production crew or what have you, I'm not sure why, but it's a little bit. It's a little bit of a greater sort of challenge somehow, because I don't get the benefit of really being able to sort of connect on some kind of direct psychic level with people in the room, because there is nobody in the room. I have to connect with my sort of sense of, who the audience is, who this anonymous audience is in aggregate. That is to say, the invisible individuals who will be seeing me from behind their own computer screens or TV or mobile screens and devices and so forth. Now, you would think it wouldn't really make a difference in terms of my own level of comfort speaking directly to a video camera as opposed to doing what I'm doing now, which is just speaking into an audio recording device. But somehow or other, this is just more comfortable. I mean, I know that you guys hear me, and clearly I'm in my NPR gear with this particular format. When I'm on a video camera, I tend to be more performative. But I don't know, maybe I don't have a well fleshed out understanding of why it is I feel sort of differently between the two mediums. But in any event, the more kind of relaxed mode I find myself in just speaking into the audio device, the the more appropriate that seems to be for the type of subject matter I want to cover here. So that's a very long preamble, and so if you don't have patience for long preambles, then this particular podcast series on the Wood Review, this particular subset of Wood Review programming may not quite be for you. And if it's not, that's okay. But I do think that life is best lived deliberately, and lessons are best learned that way. And so, hopefully, if you fancy diving deep into issues and ideas and dynamics of society, you won't mind wading through my ample verbiage, so to speak. So anyway, so my name is John Wood Jr. I said a lot for a guy who probably should be conscious of the fact that many people in his audience will not yet know who he is, especially if you're just now tuning in and whatnot. But to just give you a little bit of my background. So the reason most people who know me is because, well, most people know me through the political zone as kind of a regional figure, I guess, in Los Angeles. And even then, you would have to have followed politics in LA pretty closely to just readily recall who I am. But I was a Republican nominee for Congress in the 43rd District of California back in 2014. From what I understand, I was the youngest nominee for Congress in America, the youngest African-American nominee for Congress in America from a major party in that election cycle. That's something that if I was aware of that earlier on in the race, I would have played that up a bit. But as it was, that didn't occur to me until towards the end of the election that was so. So I was only able to get minimal marketing value out of that fact. But I ran against Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And Maxine Waters is no stranger to anybody who follows politics with any sort of regularity, I think. She's one of the great firebrands in the history of the House of Representatives, I would say. And that was a campaign filled with stories and anecdotes and lessons that I'm sure I'll have occasion to share across the course of time here as these episodes continue. I was a second vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County after that, and got to see the inside of party politics through that occupation. Then subsequent to that, I sort of returned to really kind of the roots of my interest in politics, which is to say that I returned to trying to make a difference in politics from outside of the traditional partisan structures, because the truth is that I don't consider myself to be a partisan individual, though I am a registered Republican and do intend on remaining so. But I began looking for opportunities to do what I think is the most important work to be done in politics, and that is to say to help lay the groundwork for a greater sense of compassion, respect, and understanding, including cultural understanding, between the constituencies of the right and the left, Democrats and Republicans, across America. And I found an amazing vehicle for that kind of work, an organization, really a community of Democrats and Republicans from across America who were already doing that sort of work in an extraordinary way, on an extraordinary level. And that is an organization called Better Angels. And if you're listening to this podcast right now, there's a pretty good chance that the reason you were turned in the direction of this program is because perhaps you are yourself a member of the Better Angels community. And if you're not, I encourage you to look into what Better Angels is and get involved if you care about the health of the civic dialogue in America, as I do. Just to summarize very briefly what Better Angels does. Better Angels is thus far known. Well, let me mention where Better Angels comes from. Better Angels was founded by an individual named David Blankenhorn. David is an accomplished author and public intellectual who was previously who's known previously for being the founder and president of the Institute for American Values. David has had a focus on the importance of fatherhood and the importance of family in the context of society and for the health of the individual and so forth. He's well known in that field of contemplation, and it has a program basically of mediation between Democrats and Republicans in local communities that was designed by Professor Bill Doherty of the University of Minnesota. And in this groundbreaking and cutting-edge program, what Better Angels does is we basically train organizers and moderators in local communities to bring together Democrats and Republicans on the local level to sort of sit them down together in a room or in a common place where they can eventually get to the point of being able to discuss controversial issues from one side to the other, but where they start off simply being allowed to express themselves, to express how they feel they are misunderstood by their counterparts on the other side of the aisle, and to, in the presence of their counterparts from the other side of the aisle, speak within their own partisan groups about the ways in which their own side can improve and the ways in which they as Republicans might be critical of the Republican Party, or they as Democrats might be critical of the Democratic Party. And only after having sort of opened this space for, really I should say, after having opened these windows, or polished these windows through which one side can see the other side, not as the caricatures as they are often times illustrated to be on social media and political and partisan media, but rather as the individuals that they see themselves as, and rather as the human beings demonstrating the honest feelings and perspectives that they can see them holding in this context. Only after all of those opportunities for understanding have been developed are the two sides brought together to really speak directly to each other about how they feel about certain things, and to have more of a sort of direct, albeit guided conversation directly between the two sides. And what generally happens coming out of these events is that people, right and left, Democrat and Republican, red and blue, which is the way Better Angels usually refers to people from the right and people from the left, respectively. Red and blue come out of these meetings with an entirely transformed feeling, and I use that word deliberately, with an entirely transformed feeling towards one another as human beings, as well, typically, I'm sure, as greater insight into the logical justification that each side might have for its own particular point of view. And what's born from these meetings are friendships and enduring relationships, and I think something of an immunity, it'll vary according to the individual, of course, but something of an immunity to the sort of disease that is, the viral disease that is downloaded into our conscious and subconsciousness by the partisan media outlets, and the radio and cable news, etc., that it really programmed us to think the very, very worst of each other on account of mere party affiliation or ideological leaning. And so I'm really for me, I'm speaking quite literally when I say that Better Angels is doing God's work, and I'm happy to be a part of it. Now, the Wood Review, this program, and everything you see on the Wood Review channel, but the Wood Review is a project of Better Angels Media. And Better Angels Media is a larger media, sort of digital media network enterprise which seeks to basically provide new and useful content and media options for people who are interested in getting beyond the limitations and the sort of perverseness of standard partisan news outlets and information outlets and opinion commentary shows, etc. It's a project that seeks to bring you greater media choices in a way that's positive and constructive and thought-provoking and moral, I would say, but also seeks to connect the people within the Better Angels community through the vehicle of these programs, turning you on to different opportunities that there are to participate in the Better Angels community, whether as a person who's actively seeking to participate in a workshop, to be an organizer or a moderator yourself, to connect with other people in our membership base, to do things in your own community in the direction of depolarization or political collaboration or otherwise, or even just as a sustaining member or patron of the different content, so you can see some of the really amazing productions and sort of bonus materials that we're going to be having for people who wind up, say, subscribing to the Wood Review Patreon channel or to Better Angels Media Patreon accounts and so forth that will be coming online shortly. Better Angels, to begin with, has a sort of broad affiliation with many different influential and fascinating thinkers and public figures who will be highlighted on the network and who I imagine I'll have some occasion to talk to on this program as time goes along. And by taking advantage of the different opportunities that will rise in the Better Angels media network to be a special contributor and patron and so forth, or even just a member in the Better Angels community, you'll have special access to special content as well as potentially access to different content creators and some of the different public figures and thinkers and intellectuals and so forth who are part of the sort of leadership team of Better Angels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of room for leadership on all levels, really, in the Better Angels community and in the sort of organized, sort of structured movement that Better Angels is maturing to be, I'll say. And so the Wood Review exists within that context. And, this, like I called it a structured movement a moment ago, and I think that's right. It's a structured movement for civility that includes a media presence, which is going to be valuable and important, but that also jumps off the screen. Better Angels is more than a hashtag. Depolarizing America is more than a hashtag. It's something that jumps off the screen into people's real lives. And so ultimately, Better Angels as a community exist digitally, but in its most important manifestations, it exists in you if you're willing to be a part of this work and to bring this work to your own community. And even just listening to me here is a way of supporting that, but there are many other ways to get involved, and you can find more information at www.better-angels.org. Well, there'll be a link in the description below. So stay involved with us. Okay, so that's the second long preamble. Although that is part of the show, because, I think that the interesting thing about digital media these days is whether you're talking about the Young Turks and their media network, or say the Rubin Report or Pod Save America or whatnot. I mean, the reason people support so many of these political media enterprises is because they see them as being more than just entertaining. They see them as being sort of institutions, maybe, or organizations that are advocating for the interests of their viewers beyond just entertaining their viewers. And however true that is or is not in the case of the Blaze or Prager University or any other outlet out there you can name, I think it just speaks to the fact that, one, there's a natural desire on the part of people across America from all sides to want to get involved in communities that are actually moving in a constructive direction. And two, that our faith in traditional institutions in America has diminished to the point to where we're looking for these alternatives that are kind of springing up organically in different places, and certainly in the digital sphere. And three, that the digital sphere itself is really, well suited, I think, to the imaginative and the creative energies, to harnessing the creative energies of individuals who would like to organize around new ways of both acting and thinking in the political sphere and elsewhere, and so forth. And so it's quite the opportunity that we have here to do something impactful in the context of moving American society forward, along with, and obviously that's something that has a political thrust to it, but, there are many ways in which we must work together to advance the interests of the United States of America. And in so doing, I hope the world, because I am a patriot and I claim that title confidently and assertively, but at the same time I think that patriotism is perverse if your pride in your nation doesn't correlate to your nation's desire and willingness to serve the rest of the world. So that's a broader conversation. But here we are. So it's time to sort of think about what broader conversation to have here in this first episode of the Wood Review Philosophy. Yeah, okay, geez, I'm still thinking about that damn thing. Clearly this is not meant to be CNN or even NPR necessarily. This is something that you are building with me. I say this to you as the listener. Because, we're not just looking to build an audience, we are looking to build a community. But what I intend to focus on in this show is the need to kind of reframe our current understanding of really just the broader, the socio-political reality of the United States in the current day, and that on the broadest level. Okay, so let's start there. Now, before we can even really get in to talking about what the United States' real political situation is currently, we've got to recognize the fact that the political reality facing the United States of America today, and, I just used a phrase there that is about as loaded as it could possibly be. We'll unpack it, because when I say political reality, you might be asking, well, is he talking about our economic situation? Is he talking about social issues? Is he talking about culture wars? Is he talking about foreign policy, the health of government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Short answer is all of the above. So, stick around and we'll unpack it. But even before beginning to sort of itemize the components of, our political circumstance writ large, we have to recognize the fact that our political circumstances are a reflection of several different levels of reality that impact human society, the consciousness, I suppose, of human society, including the health of our social culture, our intellectual institutions, our faith-based institutions, our popular culture, the institution of the family itself, and really the state of the individual, her and himself. All of these different levels of analysis, really, I think, all of these different areas of inspection, I think probably all precede politics in terms of their importance, in terms of their bearing in upon our lives. Politics, I think, tends to come after all of those things. Now, it does affect all of those things in turn. So there's a reciprocal relationship between culture and politics, let's say, and then politics to culture, right? Politics arises from culture, but then as politics matures and develops its own constituent institutional arms and social features, then it winds up moving the culture. Oh, geez, there's a Daniel Patrick Moynihan quote that would be perfect for this moment. Maybe I can find it here. This is the other cool thing about doing the audio podcast, is because, I used to be very good at memorizing quotes of all kinds, but now I hardly have time to sit around just committing things to memory. But I'll bring that up. But the observation that I'm making here is the fact that we spend so much time and energy talking about politics in America that we really don't even leave ourselves room to realize the fact that we're spending 90% of our energy focusing on an area of societal concern that is indeed very important, but that is probably represents about 10% of what we should really be honing in on and applying our intellectual and our social energies to. And, it's funny because on the one hand, okay, well, let me pause here because I found the Daniel Patrick Moynihan quote here. He says, "The central conservative truth is that it is culture, not politics, that determines the success of a society. The central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself." Okay, and that's about right, and that's about what I was getting at. I mean, culture. Breitbart, Andrew Breitbart, I think, said, or is credited as having said that politics exists downstream from culture. I think that's how he said it. And that's true, and Moynihan acknowledges it as much, but then and that's the conservative truth, right? So traditionally speaking, I suppose that conservative political rhetoric is focused more on the importance of culture, and that's because conservatives begin with a greater focus. Conservatives, in comparison to what you would call, what I would term modern liberals, is distinct from classical liberals, let's say, but conservatives tend to begin their moral and political evaluations with a focus on that which is most local to you, that which is most local to the individual. So starting with the individual himself and then moving up to consider the health of the family, and then the local community and the state, and finally up to the larger national level, whereas liberals tend to start from sort of the outside in their conceptions of society as a whole and the points at which they'd want to leverage the powers of society to be able to reform things for the benefits of members of society at every level, i.e. the government and so forth. Liberals tend to be more focused on using the government creatively to be able to address social problems, whereas conservatives will often say these problems can only be solved if people take personal responsibility and if families and local communities take greater responsibility for themselves. So, but Moynihan, I think, had it right that, there is truth in both perspectives. And Moynihan himself, I think, would have identified himself as a liberal, and his sentiment that politics can, quote, change a culture and save it from itself is maybe a bit idealistic, a bit romantic, but I think that there's a lot of good that politics can do. But tying all that back to the observation I'm formulating here, the truth, I think the greatest truth is that regardless of what level of analysis we're looking at society through, whether we're looking at at political society through whether we're looking at the sort of macro governmental level or looking at it as something that springs up from the individual unit outwards through more basic units stacked one on top of the other and so forth, coming outward from the central significance of the individual. I think we have to realize that, you know, the political lens through which we see things has to be informed by an underwriting, an undergirding, maybe an underwriting is a better way to say this, but it has to be served by a more foundational moral perspective, which builds up into the cultural values which create the atmosphere in which people interact socially and so forth. You know, understanding these levels of our, you know, our psychological, emotional, then social, and also spiritual realities helps us to contextualize just what the real significance is of our, you know, political talking points and positions and so forth. And if we understand them through these other lenses, if we're willing to sort of cease with the idea that, you know, political truth is anything like truth in a larger sense, because I mean, I don't know, what is political truth? What I mean when I say that is that people have a real quick sort of urge, many people, to think that they are justified in holding stridently to a partisan or controversial opinion because they feel as if the ideological consistency that they've rested that opinion upon is very persuasive, and is so persuasive that it just defeats all of the opposing, you know, arguments that the opposite ideology might put forth in its stead. And so people think that if they can win an argument, that suggests that they have a grasp on truth, right? But what's interesting is that, you know, the relationship between argument and truth, I think, is kind of a bit of a tenuous one anyway, which isn't to say that argument and debate are not important. I think they are. But, you know, it's just to say that, interestingly, even though people, you know, partisans in general, even though partisan individuals tend to operate on this sort of presupposition, the persuasive power of their argumentation, we're talking about, you know, firebrand pundits on the left like Lawrence O'Donnell or Keith Olbermann or whoever you could think of, or on the right, people like traditionally like guys like Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh and so forth. But, you know, each of these individuals seems to be increasingly effective at preaching to the choir, but I mean, they tend to have very little persuasive purchase in the direction of speaking to that which is persuadable in people who are not already sort of, you know, stationed in their cultural milieu. Now, you know, people switch sides all the time. That's certainly true. And the running dialogue that exists between the talking heads and so forth is a part of what greases the wheel for that. I'm not doubting that. But it's also a big part of what gums up the works of our broader capacity to communicate, because most people are not, you know, are not political animals like that. And that's sort of an irony which I was going to get to, because what I was leaning towards saying a moment ago was that it's interesting because on the one hand we spend so much of our intellectual energies talking about politics, you know, even though politics is probably something like a, you know, 10 or 15% area of proper concern if it were, you know, again, properly proportioned to the other areas of life that we should be focusing on. Again, it's an important area. It's an area I myself feel like I know fairly well, so I'm engaging in that conversation. And yet, you know, it seems like at least 50% of the American people aren't really engaged in politics at all. Although, perversely, I think that Donald Trump, by being, you know, seemingly so, well, certainly so polarizing and for many people seemingly so destructive, has probably motivated more people to begin paying attention to politics. He's also more entertaining than past presidents, so that helps civic participation in some way. But excuse me. So there's this strange imbalance. On the one hand, you know, not enough people in general are really engaged in the political process, because I think, I mean, it is polarizing and it is ugly on so many different levels. But on the other hand, those people who are engaged in the political process, who kind of set the pace and the tone of political conversation for everyone else, are engaged in it disproportionately and sort of like to the exclusion of a more balanced kind of relationship to the other aspects of life and to the other elements of life and society, which would make them healthier agents of political discourse. And obviously, these two observations are quite related, I think. So we don't want to be like that here at the Wood Review, and as members of the the community of Better Angels. We want to consider politics through the lens, from the sort of aerial vantage point of, I think, a more well-rounded kind of global view of human nature and morality, really, the nature of goodness and moral striving in the context of the life of the individual and the context of society. So why don't we begin thinking about that particular kind of contemplation here and see if we can't wed it back to politics. Because again, I mean, politics is going to be a pretty big focus for me on this program, although we're going to branch out very far from that, and I think, but it's very central to the concern of myself, to my career, that the work of Better Angels and so forth. But maybe politics, interestingly, can serve as a doorway by which people who want to get involved in important conversations on the societal level can actually find their way through it to deeper conversations that impact politics, but also are very valuable in and of themselves. And at the very top of that list, I would put a contemplation of, and a discussion of morality. Just what morality truly is, and why it is so, or why a consideration of it and an embodiment of it ought to be bedrock to the intellectual and social foundations of our culture, political and otherwise. So, what is morality? It's more complicated, I think, than some people might be quick to admit. But it's also simple. Morality is tied very closely to the idea of goodness, right? It's hard to imagine a person being moral without serving the interests of that which is good. Now, it's interesting because in normal life, certainly in politics, when we start to talk about morality, that's a conversation that breaks down in different ways depending on where you are in the political sort of universe in America, and I imagine elsewhere as well. But, in America, if you're talking about morality in a conservative setting, well, you're probably going to be talking about morality as existing as a very absolute quantity, that there is a singular truth, generally speaking, the truth as sort of moral truth is sort of outlined in the value system undergirding the Judeo-Christian religion, that allows us to, to apply a very clear filter through which to process the relative ethical worth and value of competing political and moral systems and so forth, because we have this strict truth on the conservative side, and it makes sense of things in a very kind of, efficient way, I would say. Before I jump into the substance of that, I'll just sort of identify the parallel philosophical structure on the left. And these are sweeping generalizations, but they're definitely true enough to make these points, I think. On the left, you have, different points of origin for people on the left. Traditionally, you would think as the morality on the left as having derived in its, sort of conceptual roots from the Enlightenment period and the secular, scientific, materialist perspective that sort of evolved from that starting point on through the scientific and the revolution, the industrial revolution, and so forth, into the tradition of liberalism that does itself focus on the value of the individual and the right of the individual to free speech, free expression, and so forth. But that has also mutated a little bit over the course of time in the United States into modern liberalism and what's called progressivism, I think, which has to do with certainly freedom for the individual, particularly in the area of lifestyle and identity in many respects. But that also has to do with advocating for the rights of common people against the oppressive coalitions of the elites and so forth. And so, therein, somewhere in this mix, arises a moral focus on equality, which is, related to the idea of fairness and so forth. And in this, you do have sort of a number of different, I feel, moral roots. Again, going back to the Enlightenment, but also going back to going to the civil rights movement and arising from, to a certain degree, socialist and even Marxist influence and so forth. And I say this without prejudice. I mean, I'm just observing this. The tradition of scientific materialism, which suggests that, truth and for some maybe even moral considerations can be identified through scientific investigation and so forth. I mean, it's a little less unified than the moral perspective that persists on the right. But there's a rich pool of dynamics in left of center moral conception, I suppose you could say, which has informed much of the social progress that has been made in the history of the United States of America. And if you just trace much of that back to the Enlightenment, you'll have an easy time seeing that much of it is noble, just as is so much of the moral principles undergirding the Judeo-Christian tradition. So you have these two kind of basic divides in moral conception from the right and from the left. And there's these complicated histories behind them. But in our own time, I think that we find ourselves in a situation to where we still have this age-old tension between these sort of religious and the secular kind of visions of morality and so forth. And I think what enters into that as well to make things more complicated, and I think that this is kind of the you could look at this as a third element being kind of the gateway by which the progressive kind of moral vision enters into the equation, or maybe the progressive moral vision is the gateway through which another set of social interests enters the equation, which have their own sort of moral point of view. But, then you have this third element, nevertheless, which is kind of this emphasis on equality, and particularly equality and quality and recompense being sort of made available. That this third angle basically advocates for its moral focus is on the obtaining of justice for disempowered and disenfranchised minorities and other marginalized people, like women, for instance. in the context of American society. And so, equality winds up being a foundation moral value, as stated a moment ago, for the sort of wide assortment of different demographic groups in this part of the political spectrum. And so what you could think of as, roughly speaking, the conservative, the liberal, and the progressive competing moral visions here. And it's funny to put liberal in the middle here, but I'm doing it. I'll build out this vision for you as we go. There's a tension that exists between these three sides, which places us in a sort of uniquely, I don't want to say uniquely volatile, because America has been more volatile in the past than it is today. But it certainly, in the context of the last several decades, places us in a uniquely volatile moment in very recent American history. American history, say, extending back between 40 and 50 years or so. I would probably venture to suggest that. Of course, I'm 31. You probably have some folks listening to this video saying like, "Ah, man, this kid doesn't remember Watergate and Vietnam and how messed up things were in the 70s, yada yada yada." But we're in a bit of a unique moment because we have there are a number of things at work, I think, in all of this today. But part of the reason I think we find ourselves struggling to communicate is because we don't have languages, really. Most people still speak English, but we don't really have the vocabulary to communicate across these lines of moral division. And also, therefore, we fail to be able to communicate across the lines of cultural division that sort of grow out of, these moral foundations. I'm hoping I'm conceptualizing that right, but I think that that's close enough to being correct for me to continue on this track for now. Historically, I think that part of the reason you had an Enlightenment and period, and part of the reason why the secular movement has grown so strong over time is that, in addition to the fact that science has given us alternative explanations for understanding the world, religious, the structure of religious life and the institutions that religious life have yielded historically, and certainly in the history of the Western world, but all over the world really, have been such that for human beings who naturally want to pursue new ideas and who naturally want to create and innovate new ways of looking at things and experiencing things in life, the ties that bind you in religious life to old ways of thinking and old ways of looking at the world and old ways of interacting with one another, and certainly the restrictiveness that comes with having to abstain from sin when sin can be so delightful, as so many of us know, or what people call sin and so forth, even to the point at which it may seem to legitimately negate the entire lifestyle that you would otherwise wish to and perhaps find fulfillment in living. Let's say if you're homosexual, for instance, in the context of a more orthodox religious environment. Well, religious society can kind of be counted upon to reliably export people from its ranks into whatever social alternative social structures there are for people to go to, because human beings weren't necessarily made to, or alternatively human beings did not necessarily evolve to live that way universally, right? And each, different religious denominations are different and so forth, and not every Christian group is puritanical, so to speak, but religion on the other hand, doesn't really have very much, may not really have very much value, may not really be religion if it doesn't have a lot of built-in limitations on lifestyle, that go into it. So we have this epistemological divide between secularists and religious individuals. We have a divide of values and a divide of lifestyle, right? Now, I think that for many people coming from each side of that particular divide, I'm calling this the liberal conservative divide here, but it's really the secular religious divide, But for many of them, there is this kind of common strain even between those two sides, right? That runs way to the beginning of what we would call the classical liberalism, or the overarching liberal tradition of the West, which is just to say the tradition that really begins the sort of recognition of the value of the individual, the sovereignty of the individual, and the importance, the inalienable right of the individual to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but also freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, expression, etc. That this uniquely Western and particularly American liberal tradition, this overarching liberal tradition, many of you will know from poli-sci class, is one that incorporates both modern liberalism and conservatism, right, as well as libertarianism and I think arguably progressivism and so on and so forth. It's one that has a common sort of root in the importance of freedom of thought and intellectual exchange and so forth. Reason is a root that is common to the core of both American Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, if you like, and American secular society, by and large. And it's interesting because we look at these things as being, dichotomous, that these are polar opposites, really. But they, and certainly in the context of the spectrum of perspective that exists in America, these are two fundamental poles, as I've mentioned. But the Christianity that we inherited in the United States, primarily, many Catholics in America, of course, contributed mightily, but America is, largely a Christian nation, and at that, largely a Protestant nation. And, one of the fundamental values of underwriting Protestantism is man's, certainly at least, the Christian's right to think and worship as he pleases and to have his own relationship with God that does not require these sort of, big government intercessory, mediation of a state-like church, such as the Roman church traditionally was in Europe. It was so you have this sense in Protestantism that the individual is important. He's got value enough to have his own relationship with God apart from the bureaucratic structure of the organized church such as it had been. And so there's a focus on the worth of the individual in Protestantism. I'm not saying that you don't have some focus on the worth of the individual in Catholicism either, but in this context, there's a particular focus on that, which does indeed parallel, I believe, the focus on the value of the individual in the Enlightenment and the liberal tradition, more broadly speaking. And similarly, the religious experience of Christians in Protestantism has been one that has not been conceptualized so as to require, again, the kind of institutional or organizational sort of guidance of the church, so much as it has been one that has emphasized the importance of the gifts of the Spirit and the necessity of every believer to discover his own personal relationship with God the Father, with Christ Jesus, and to experience for himself the presence of the Holy Spirit and so forth. And so we've got this great tradition of revival in American Christianity and evangelicalism and evangelical Protestantism, etc. And really, I mean, that parallels a bit the liberal and also the sort of secular emphasis on freedom of lifestyle. I mean, it's not to say that your options for lifestyles aren't a bit more limited in conservative American Protestantism than it's going to be in liberal secular society, where in many respects sort of like anything goes in terms of like sexual and gender identification and sexual orientation, so on and so forth. But that even so, part of what was gifted to Protestants was the right to worship as we darn well please, that we didn't have to be told exactly how to pray and so forth, that we do have an authority, and that authority is the Word, but, the Word speaks to us from within, and we have preachers and religious authorities and so on and so forth, but we choose them, So the sovereignty of the individual in both the American Christian and the American liberal context is very significant. And so, in part because of these common roots, I think that in the past, it has been possible for conservatives and liberals to have a conversation, but in order to have that conversation, you have to go back to those fundamental roots, because otherwise you're caught up in the differences and you're not able to recognize the similarities. Now, the progressive leg of the stool, what I'm calling the progressive leg of the stool. By the way, I hate labels, just so you all know, because I can feel a few of you nitpicking at my use of certain terms, I'm sure, but I'm using them the best I can. But really, I can nitpick at my use of terms and anybody's use of these labels because they're almost necessarily imprecise in many respects. But again, I think I'm right enough in everything that I'm saying to justify continuing to say it for now. But the progressive leg of the stool is unique to both of these in a sense. Now, we tend to consider liberal and progressive to both mean left-leaning, and traditionally that is true. There's a larger history to the progressive, what's been called the progressive movement in the United States, that goes to, I think, largely the beginnings of the 20th century and so forth, and it's just had a lot to do with organizing labor and progressively sort of asserting the rights of disenfranchised and marginalized groups of people, not necessarily ethnic groups, but certainly economic groups, working class individuals and so forth, in ways that allowed for them to be protected from the exploitation and sort of abusive practices of the oligarchs in American business and so on and so forth. The way the term progressivism has kind of evolved these days is it carries with it an emphasis on the importance of advocating for a broader range of underrepresented, presumably underrepresented or marginalized individuals that very much falls along ethnic lines and so forth. And I think that, today's progressivism has an aspect to its narrative that Teddy Roosevelt, the great progressive Republican president. I'm not sure you could really identify another one akin to Teddy Roosevelt, but he would not have recognized this, and he probably would have been alarmed by it. But there seems to be an underwriting presupposition in the progressive perspective that says that, and I'm generalizing. And it's up to you to, ask yourself how true or not true this generalization may be. And I'm happy to hear from you in comments or whatnot. But, I'd say keep it civil, but I mean, you you're a free woman or a free man. You should voluntarily wish to raise the dialogue to a higher level of civility. So I'll try and set a good example, but people will say what they will. But there seems to be this underwriting presupposition to progressivism which says that the existing power structures in the West generally, and certainly in the United States in particular, were erected upon the edifice of the exploitation of marginalized groups of people, including Native Americans, whose land was obtained through slaughter and genocide, and Africans, labor from African Americans, which was obtained by force through slavery, and the further exploitation of Latinos and Asians, Chinese, and women, and oppression, of various groups and so forth. That the wealth and power of the West, and certainly the white, the Anglo-patriarchal West, which is, Anglo and patriarchal is sort of what characterizes the West fundamentally in this perspective, I think. And that the goal of political agitation, therefore, needs to be to remedy this historic sequence and pattern of injustices. And that's kind of like the animating spirit that goes into a lot of progressive organization and agitation. Now, look, I do think it's possible to look at yourself as progressive and to not necessarily articulate it in quite that way, but really, it just seems to me that interacting with people who call themselves progressives these days, certainly the younger ones, and keep in mind, I'm 31, I'm technically a millennial, even among white millennials who would identify themselves as progressives, I don't think that they would look at that description as being really particularly inaccurate. I think that they would look at what I've said here as being more or less a reasonable summation of the history of the West and the purpose of political organizing in the modern day in response to that. Now, my auntie, for instance, she's a white upper middle class woman, highly educated. I think she would probably historically consider herself a liberal, but I think that she would probably also, if you called her a progressive, I don't think that she would wince at that. She may even call herself a progressive sometimes. I don't know, but I just get the sense, I'll have to ask her, but I don't think that she would shy away from the label progressive. Let's just put it like that. And yet, I think that she probably has an older sort of understanding of the idea of progressivism as being one that exists, again, for to advance the interests of the marginalized and the underserved against that of the powerful and the a priori established groups of influencers in American society who have to be sort of, challenged in the political sphere to be more fair in the distribution of their power, perhaps whether they like it or not, of course, because the state has a right to regulate where imbalances persist that grieve justice, that grieve social justice, for instance. But I doubt that my aunt, even though my aunt would probably readily agree that there has been sort of a built-in corruption in the history of, this country and the Western world to a great degree that has grown out of the hubris of the sort of, the elites in the elites of the Anglo race, I suppose. I was looking for a term other than race, but, simplistically speaking, we could just say white race. But I don't think that she would characterize the goal of progressivism or social justice as being to combat the white power structure, even if she felt that as an incidental matter, that's what it had to do. But regardless of her in particular, I just think that there's probably an older generation of progressives who don't quite have as racialized a perspective on what it means to be a progressive, but that nevertheless, this more sort of racially polarized point of view on the proper sort of exercise of political activism in American society is something that very much kind of represents the disposition of progressives now, or certainly progressives of my generation. That's what I suspect. There's a lot to be said about that, and I think the first thing I would be tempted to say about it right now is that, there's a lot more truth to the progressive point of view, if that's how we're defining it, than many liberals, and certainly just about any conservatives might be readily able to see and observe. But so are the excesses of that point of view all very clear. But the important thing to consider right now is just the polarization that results in our communication, resulting from the inability of the other poles there, liberal and conservative, to be able to sort of relate to the progressive perspective. Now, liberals and progressives tend to be a little bit closer to one another, at least on the policy points of views. And so, both liberals and progressives tend to believe that the government has a right, that it is legitimate for the state to exercise sort of redistributive function. I must be getting tired. A redistributive function in terms of, allocating the wealth of society in such a way to where the state is able to ensure that resources are granted more fairly in order to make up for the inequality of opportunity that persists thanks to the activities of elites in society, which are always trying to twist the forces of the marketplace and the political sphere to serve their own interests, which I might add they do indeed tend to do. And so liberals and progressives converge on that. And it's particularly stark today, where we see a divide between liberals and progressives, it emerges more in the cultural zone than it does immediately in the political zone. Because, progressives and liberals would both tend to agree with each other on the need for, say, universal health care, higher taxes, strong welfare state, whatever the case may be. It varies according to the individual, but this is why these terms can be used somewhat interchangeably. And yet, you have fierce divides that are becoming evident, particularly in the sort of intellectual battles that we have ample windows to online between accomplished sort of free thinkers and academic liberals like scientists and skeptics like Sam Harris and Michael Shermer and Brett and Eric Weinstein and the podcast host Dave Rubin, who has coalesced a lot of these liberal figures and united them with conservative voices who share with them a belief in the importance of free speech and intellectual inquiry. And, with liberals and with these particular types of, academic and scientifically literate liberals, part of their interest in freedom of intellectual inquiry and free speech and so forth has to do with their belief in the essentially the sanctity of allowing the scientific process to proceed unimpeded, and that includes holding to the proper understanding of certain biological truths which find themselves at times conflicting with the social agenda of the progressive movement, as I've sort of described it a moment ago. And it is a movement that wishes in many places to assert the right of individuals to identify, for instance, as a certain gender, regardless of whatever it is whatever their biological sex may happen to be, and perhaps even more questionably, from the lens of not just conservative, but but of a liberal and of this kind. I mean, of an academic, sort of Enlightenment orientation. A liberal who truly is focused on the unquestioned importance of raw logic, is this assertion that men and women are essentially the same to the extent that we are different. The progressive sort of social view of the genders is that our differences are basically encoded into us by variations in culture and society, but that they are not innate, even though it seems sort of self-evident that certain biological and physiological differences in men and women are innate, and that these differences, well, to me at least, it seems self-evident that these physiological differences at the very least would yield differences in the operations of our mental facilities, our emotional selves, of our minds, But if you cede that point, then you might cede the idea that, maybe there are reasons why, for instance, men and women might not tend to make as much, even in a free and fair marketplace in terms of monetary compensation, as well, you would have to see the point that could be a reflection of innate differences between the genders, as opposed to merely a consequence of gender bias in the workplace and whatnot. Well, there are various ways in which we, grounds for real conflict emerge between progressives and liberals. Particularly on campus, I think, seems to be very common. And so progressives oftentimes lump liberals, or people who identify themselves as otherwise progressive, like biologist and Professor Brett Weinstein of Evergreen University fame or infamy, depending on, your point of view. Brett Weinstein, for anybody who doesn't know, Brett Weinstein is a professor from Evergreen State University, and is it a state? Yeah, Evergreen State College. Where is Evergreen? Google. Tell me. Remind me. Is it Washington? Yeah, it's in Olympia, Washington. And, oh goodness, am I going to tell this story right now? I mean, this is something I'll probably return to. Goodness, it would be wonderful to be able to talk to Brett Weinstein, as a matter of fact. If anybody wants to forward this to Brett, feel free to do so. But I mean, to just wrap it up in short, at Evergreen State College, as I recall, it's a diverse campus, very liberal, progressive, left-leaning campus with a diverse student body, and I believe that there's been a traditional event on that campus called it might be called a Day Without a Minority or something to that effect, where minority students stay home as a way of highlighting the importance of the contributions of minorities to American society in general. So it's kind of just like ethnic minorities get a day off, a special day off at Evergreen State College, which probably doesn't bother you if you're a genuine white liberal or certainly white progressive and so forth. And it never bothered Brett Weinstein, except that more recently, the event was given a bit of a twist, and instead of minorities voluntarily staying home, it was recommended to the white student body that there's a plan for an event that was basically like a day without white people on campus. And the recommendation was set out that white professors stay home. And I believe that what happened was so Brett Weinstein opposed this because this seemed to be, to him, a more pernicious kind of racial segregation that resembled too much the type of segregation that, the original social justice advocates like Martin Luther King Jr. and the great heroes of the civil rights movement and so forth fought against. And so I believe that his wife, who was also a professor at that university, wrote an email criticizing this event and Professor Weinstein, well, Brett Weinstein, he and his wife are both professors, I believe. He attended and taught his class that day. And if you look on YouTube and type in Brett Weinstein evergreen conflict, or or what have you, you'll find the clips where students get wind of the fact that the husband of this female professor who wrote this critical email, which was just rounded on by maybe faculty as well, but students and activists from across the campus, that he was there that day, and so he was encircled in his classroom and berated in just spectacularly emotional fashion by these students who accused him of advocating for white supremacy, among other things. And Brett Weinstein, to his credit, and it's funny because he's standing there in like these really kind of like high-rise biker shorts or something. I can't remember what he was wearing exactly. He looked a little funny the way he was dressed, given the context. But he held his ground. He was not aggressive. He was not pandering or demeaning, at least not from my point of view when I watched it. He tried to engage them in a reasonable discourse, but they took his even being there as being a signal that he was, in a hostile way, sort of delegitimizing the grievances and maybe the very identities of, all of the non-white students on campus. Okay, so why do I mention this? Here's the barrier of communication here, as I see it. Now, I'm a person from a multicultural, multi-ethnic background, as I mentioned. Mom's black, dad's white, but I've got cousins who are, Mexican, Brazilian, Belizean. I've got family members who are Jewish, both secular Jews and Orthodox Jews alike. I'm including adopted relatives there, but still. America, the United States of America, has become substantially more diverse from an ethnic point of view, across the entire course of its history, but particularly, I think, as we go into the 1950s and 60s, when coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, you have the major advances made in terms of advocating for the equal rights of racial minorities in the United States, as opposed to just, merely the rights or opportunities of women or laborers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, over the course of time, you have this influx of different ethnic groups into the United States of America as, immigration laws change and the already constant, pull to the world's immigrants and huddled masses and so forth. This has always been sounded forth by the promise of freedom and prosperity and liberty in America is augmented by these changes. You wind up having a situation where suddenly, major parts, major sections of the cloth of the tapestry of American culture are suddenly being stitched together and designed by people who are coming in more recently, more removed from the older eras of, liberal American democracy, American liberal democracy and so forth. They have narratives on the United States of America and just history in general that are not drawn really from the West, as much from the Western European tradition, be it Protestant or Enlightenment. People bring their own. Now, it's the Western tradition is so ubiquitous in the West that even if you're coming from Latin America, or even if you're, maybe coming over from China, given the interaction it's had with the West and so forth. People come to this country. I think they seldom have zero relationship to cultural forces that may be considered Western. But the point is just that, the Western, certainly the Anglicanized kind of understanding of American history is not one that's, being romanticized as much by African Americans, who always had reasons to, be distrustful of anything traditionally sort of Anglo in the history of the United States, just in as much as we can, imagine a crude association between that and the oppressive white racism that has defined so much of the black experience in America. African Americans, as they asserted political power in the United States of America, certainly as the 20th century progressed into its latter half, were not going to be romantically enthralled with this Western European tradition, be it conservative or liberal, really. Latin Americans coming to this country, the descendants of, European, Spanish, Catholic powers, which is a little bit different, of course, than the Protestant Anglican ancestors of the founding generations of Americans in large part, but also these Latinos being descendants of Native Americans that were absorbed into these, European powers, but whose culture still remains and inserts itself in the context of a very kind of, culturally, I think, unique sort of Latin Catholicism in the South American, Central American, Hispanic American world, so forth. And themselves, perhaps, particularly if you're Mexican, being conscious of the fact that the United States of America did indeed wrest by force Mexican territory away from the Mexican government, and therein, I suppose, the Mexican people. Being aware of that history, they're not going to romanticize this Western Anglo-liberal tradition in the way that, conservatives and traditional liberals traditionally do, to whatever extent and in whatever way, even within the common framework of their own vast differences. Well, this is why this is the third leg of the stool. Because even though conservatives and liberals are used to disagreeing, and Dave Rubin would be an interesting person to talk to about this, but even though conservatives and liberals are used to disagreeing in striking fashion on the way the world works and the way history is, manifested and turned and so forth, there is this common commitment to the indispensable value of free speech and intellectual engagement and so forth. But for people who view the world, and it's understandable to me, for people who view the world and who view the Western world in particular as one wherein even the persistence of a certain intellectual culture in the West has really just been kind of to facilitate the dominance of, crudely speaking, white supremacy, but, just of the elite power structures that have always wielded influence within that cultural domain, and that continue to now in the form now of corporations and so forth, whereas and corrupt presidents and politicians, whereas they may once have been noblemen, monarchs, and so forth. That the only way to make sure that we do not have, say, in both, domestically in the United States of America and also in the third world, and, disadvantaged parts of the global community that are still arguably, and certainly in this worldview, under the thumb of oppressive Western powers and so forth. There's going to be very little faith put into the idea that these power structures can ultimately be reasoned away from their cruel and corrupt and exploitative and coercive activities born from malice and racism in large part, and born from greed and much of whatever's left over. And that the only adequate defense against these things is not, free speech and free inquiry, because these things can be perverted to the service of these established powerful groups. Rather, it is the assertion of organization and of organized political power that can, through the vehicle of the state, establish a more just order that guards against the exploitation of the people by setting in place just, albeit if not aggressive, rules for the management of society and for the capping of the undue power and influence of these elite groups. And the only way that this agenda can be effectively realized is if people band together, common people band together in order to pull their democratic power so as to leverage that against the money and the unearned, in many cases, wealth of acquisition that these capitalistic and established powers in the Western traditional society, well, in the Western society and in American society in particular, will and have amassed against the rights and interests of ordinary people, and certainly of marginalized peoples in America and around the world. Politics is the weapon of choice. It's the only weapon, right? And but while this is probably an accurate not an inaccurate way of describing it, and while I think describing the sort of progressive view on the proper mode of engagement that people must take in order to be able to properly oppose the oppressive and coercive powers of the existing power structures of America. Well, I think my description here is accurate in as much as I think it shows why the conversation breaks down between liberals and progressives, and certainly between conservatives and progressives who don't even have the advantage of sharing any, common kind of policy prescriptions with progressives of this kind. I think this is an accurate point of view. I do feel compelled to jump back to the fact that, this belief that society is arrayed against the interests of marginalized people is very real, and it's very real because it's based on a very real history. And so if you're authentically afraid that white supremacy is ultimately seeking the eradication of you and your kind, no matter how extreme that may seem to somebody else, if we're being objective now, whoever it is who's listening to me on this podcast here, whether you're conservative, liberal, libertarian, or otherwise, if a person has that honest fear, an honest fear based off of a real history, then that's, it only stands to reason that they might not be impressed with what, in that context, would seem like a kind of trivial obsession with free speech. And I think I saw journalists from the Washington Post, who I've had a little bit of a back and forth with before, Matthew Sears, I think it's who it was, calling Brett Weinstein's obsession with, saying that Brett Weinstein had a unhealthy obsession, definitely used the word obsession, with free speech. And I think it's because, you don't have to be a minority as a progressive to feel this way. Many, many white people feel precisely this way about white people in general, the white guilt phenomenon, which is worth talking about. If you feel that this is what society tends towards of its own particular nature in this Western context, then you might feel as if you've got no choice but to band together in a certain way to where you cut through the niceties of free speech and intellectual, civil intellectual debate and so forth, because for you, in your mind, it's life and death. And, it's an important thing to understand. All of these perspectives are important to understand for the foundational moral suppositions they bring with them. Because, the truth of the matter is that it seems to me, now we can get philosophical, now that we've been going for, how long are we at? An hour and 30 minutes? That's pretty good. That's pretty good. You get a medal if you've listened all this way. Although I expect as we go along, we'll get a few people who are able to hang with. Actually, serious podcast listeners, will listen to a good podcast for hours. I hope my podcast qualifies as a good podcast. I really do. I mean, I'm just being myself here, and I'm speaking from a life that's pretty rich with experience and analysis and so forth, given my age, but also given the breadth of what I've been exposed to, so on and so forth. But, social relationships, broad social relationships to moral values tend to reflect common points of moral interest, or moral emphasis rather, reflecting common points of moral interest among people in a particular subgroup. And so if African Americans, for instance, are very concerned with the ethic of equality, it's because African Americans have been denied equality in the history of the United States in a fairly unique kind of way. And so it makes sense that as a group, we would focus in on that a bit more than maybe others. But individuals, I think each individual, in order to really be a happy and, even more important than happy, a realized individual, to be a fulfilled person, psychologically, emotionally, and so forth, you need more than just a feeling of moral satisfaction in one area. Justice is, I was going to say justice is a moral virtue. In the classical Greek I think in the Aristotelian or the Platonic formulation, justice is sort of like the highest virtue. They gave it a somewhat different meaning than we might. But, justice is important. Seeing to it that there's justice in society can be important in allowing the individual to feel as if he is advocated for goodness. Because if justice doesn't persist socially, then that means that in a very real way, goodness cannot persist socially or in our communal environments. And if as an individual you don't take a stand for justice, then your conscience can never be able to really clear you of the feeling that perhaps you were cowardly or did not stand up for the right cause at the right time, And so to be a satisfied individual morally, I think that particularly during times of moral crisis, you do have to make a decision to stand up for justice. Now, what justice is in any given context is a different question, but the moral urge for justice, I think, is universal across human nature. But I think that there are other pulls as well. There is the pull for peace, for social harmony, and that comes with understanding. And that may not really be an objective that harmonizes with the type of political agitation that is sort of unforgiving or unyielding in its condemnation of other groups of people for asserting maybe a different list of moral or policy priorities. And yet your individual progressive is going to have a side to his or her personality that wants to really get along with and be at peace with human beings in general, right? Likewise with conservatives. I mean, your typical conservative is going to believe in the importance of individual freedom. And I can hear liberals and progressives saying, yeah, unless it's with regards to, a person's right to marry who they want or a woman's right to do what she will with her body. Yeah, of course. So granted these objections, but, a conservative is going to believe in the importance of the freedom of the individual. And, a person I don't think can really feel, I think that a person's own conscience will not let him or her get away with feeling that they have lived a good life if they have not allowed themselves to live a life and a lifestyle that is in accordance, I guess I'm being circular here, but in accordance with the demands of their own conscience, and that might include worshiping as they see fit, preaching as they see fit, espousing, the Word of God, hoping to bring people into the true church, whatever that may be. But there's also a desire to get to know people, I think, of other points of view, and a desire to be understanding towards people of other cultures and ways of living, because, any human being, be he conservative or otherwise, who finds himself in the company of other human beings long enough to realize the fact that he or she has much in common with they or them, will inevitably find his or herself preferring, I think, to be at peace with those people, particularly to the extent to which he or she relates to them, which is oftentimes a degree much greater than our political or cultural differences might suggest would be the case. But that desire sometimes finds itself in tension or in conflict with what might seem to be a religious or a political obligation to unyieldingly assert a certain point of view which doesn't allow you to render kind judgments with respect to the character, or at least the intentions, of these other groups of people. Okay, so in this episode of the Wood Review, we've identified a problem here, a problem resting within another problem. So the superficial problem is that we focus, too few of us are engaged with politics, but those of us who are engaged in politics focus too much on politics for politics' sake. And collectively, we have forgotten the fact that that which is more important than politics should require a more conscious examination of itself than politics, because it is determinative, more fundamentally speaking, of politics. And part of what is more fundamental is our culture, but in particular, our moral foundations, our sense of morality and goodness therein, which kind of sets the direction of our political and social and other activities in such a way that determines whether or not, if our morality is truly guided by the sort of pure volition of conscience. Morality, a sound moral perspective maximizes our capacity to create the environment for a good life for ourselves and the community and all humanity that exists around us. And yet, this requires, to begin this process, there's required the virtue of understanding. Understanding has to persist between us in order for us to have a positive and fruitful moral dialogue. It is a moral virtue in and of itself, is understanding. Yet, the language by which moral understanding might flourish between Americans is essentially, if it's there, it's prohibited by the fact that Americans in general, and in particular, these three groups or categories of Americans I've enumerated, conservatives, liberals, and progressives, are, this language is not allowed to grow between them because there is a lack of sort of foundational ethical understanding that exists between these groups. They don't understand where the other is coming from in many respects. But any individual in any of these three groups can develop that understanding, I believe. And that's part of what our work here must be to accomplish. So, as we go forward, I think that it's a good idea for us to think conscientiously about the ways in which we might develop understanding and, in particular, facilitate a more effective language of communication between progressives and liberals, liberals and conservatives, and progressives and conservatives, so as to allow us to develop a greater moral understanding of one another, so we can generate some real empathy. And that, perhaps, will allow us to lubricate the wheels of our civic, of our political society, so that the Republic, American democracy, might begin to function at a higher level once again. So, what do you think? Let me know. Feel free to leave comments under this video. Feel free to follow me or talk to me on Facebook or Twitter, and feel free to carry the conversation over on Better Angels, the Better Angels Media web pages and social media pages as well. You'll find your links in the description below. And just remember that this is a community for you and for everyone who is more concerned with our exercising moral righteousness and dedication and devotion to the advancement of goodness in our society beyond, over and above anybody's partisan agenda, because politics is fleeting, but the love that we have for one another stands the chance of enduring forever. You've been listening to the Wood Review with John Wood Jr. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe.